Hi guys and welcome. So bioethics, that's what this whole semester is about, a whole year's about. So bioethics is kind of an interesting class. It's a class where we're going to talk a lot together. We're going to discuss things going on in society and culture and medicine and research. And it all ties to biotechnology really well. So you'll have a book, right? Bioethics book. So, very good book. It's written very well. So, I would encourage you to read as we go through these slides. So, I'll try to make this first one probably kind of quick. Let me see if my pen works. It does not work. All right, got the pen working. All right, so we're going to start with it. So, moral and ethics. So, morality. So, morality is tied to beliefs, right? So morality is something we feel personally, right? So it's our determination of rightness and wrongness, or goodness and badness. They say that actions can be right or wrong, and people can only be good or bad, right? And so this all ties to our experience, right? So your religious beliefs may tell you that something is right, something is wrong, right? Your family has a huge influence on you, right? Because throughout your life growing up, you've been taught that is good and that is bad, and that is right and that is wrong. You'll have experiences as you get older, right? Personal experience that may change your family view, a cultural bias. What we think is right and wrong in this country may not be right and wrong in another country or another culture. And then one of the largest influences we have now is media. Right? You guys are so tied to media. So morality, right, we're going to say is subjective. Oops. So morality. So it's subjective to all these influences. So if you're a moral person, you're only a moral person because you had all this influence in your life of morality. Now, ethics is something different, right? So ethics is based on reasoning. So if we can talk about that. So ethics, study of morality using tools and methods of philosophy. Now, this word philosophy, right? So philosophy is a study study of thought, right? So, so philosophy and ethics kind of go hand in hand. There's a class in college called logic, right? Logic is from philosophy, and all logic does is Venn diagrams, right? And it looks for the common ground between two things, right? So we can say that killing and grace. Right? Grace is giving you something you don't deserve, even though you deserve differently. And we all know what killing is. So, what it looks at, when do these things intersect? Right? So, ethics will look at kind of rules. Right? There are three main branches of ethics: metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. So we'll talk about normative first, and then we'll move on to meta and applied. So normative ethics. So as you work through this, you might want to write down things or vocabulary words on a list somewhere in a notebook, so you can refer to them later. So normative ethics, right? We're really looking for moral standards here, right, or what we call norms. Deontological, right, is a form of normative ethics. So an action is either right or wrong. So deontological normative ethics, there's no gray area. Something's either right or wrong. So if you look at murder or killing, right? So deontological ethics is wrong. So, is it ever right? Right? But in deontological ethics, it can't be right. It has to be wrong, right? Because it's either right or wrong, right? It's either good or bad, right? And it's not based on the consequences, right? So this relies on rules, virtues, to guide decision making. Teleological ethics is another form of normative ethics, right? But this, a morally right action, is one that will produce the best outcome, right? So, if killing a person will save many, is it still the wrong thing to do? Well, you could argue with teleological ethics, right? Then it could be the right thing to do. So if somebody comes into your house and they want to murder you and your family, is it okay to kill that person? Right? Because if you don't kill that person, you and your family will die. Right? So the ontological ethics says it's still wrong to kill a person. You have to live with the consequences of rightness and wrongness. Teleological says it's okay to kill that person, because if they don't, they'll take away your right to a life and your family's right to a life. Right? That's the way we justify wars. Right? So really what teleological does is it looks for moral exceptions. Right? So we live most of our life in teleological ethics. We make justifications. So meta-ethics is something we don't think about, but we think about. Right? So meta-ethics is the study of the meaning. Right? So the meta-ethics question is, why? So I'm not looking at is it a good or a bad action? I'm not looking at outcomes. I'm just looking at the why. Right? Is it wrong because it robs a person of life and liberty? Is it wrong because God says so? Is it wrong because God says it's wrong? Is it wrong because culture says it's wrong? So why is it wrong? That's what meta-ethics looks at. There's a form of meta-ethics called nihilism, right? And nihilism would argue that nothing has intrinsic moral value, so nothing is right or wrong. That's what a moral nihilist would look at, right? And this goes down to a classic thought in philosophy, that everybody has a reason for doing what they do. Is it wrong to steal something from a store? Well, deontological says it is wrong because you didn't buy it, right? Teleological says it's wrong, or it might be right if stealing will make it available for you to live. If you have no money, no shelter, no food, and you're starving, is it okay to steal? Right? Meta-ethics would look, why is it wrong to steal? Because you're taking resources from somebody else who didn't intend them for you. Right? And the nihilist would say, there is no stealing, right? Because I have moral justification internally for no matter what I do. So, just different ways to look at things. So, as we move on, we're not ready yet. So, applied ethics, right? So, applied ethics is how we use normative and meta-ethics in the practice of everyday life, right? So, bioethics is a branch of applied ethics. So in bioethics, right, we have studies, we have funding, We have research. We have studies. We have marketing. And we have sales. So all of these things are going to be bound by bioethics. Funding. Who's funding your research? Right? If the federal government is funding your research, they want a particular outcome. Now, are they influencing the outcome? Probably. Right? If a drug company is funding a research project, do they have an invested interest in the outcome? The answer is yes. That's why we have a government agency called the FDA. So the FDA is kind of our moral eyes and ears to this whole problem here. Studies, right? We do double-blind studies. And the reason why we do is we want to limit influence, right, by the funding organization. Marketing, how do we market it? Do we have honesty in marketing? Do we make claims that are not true or might not be true? Or do we make claims that are only studied? And then sales, right? How much do I charge for it? Do I charge so much that only wealthy people can afford it, right? So these are all concerns for bioethicists to ask. All right, so moral norms. All right, so these are based on culture. So moral norms are based on culture. So, like I said, is it okay to steal if you don't get caught, or if you really need what you're stealing? Or some people steal because it's fun, right? Does that satisfy any of, right? So deontologically, it's wrong to steal. It's just wrong, right? Teleologically, right? If it makes you feel good and you don't get caught, is it okay to steal? That's the justification you're making. And metaethics would say, why is stealing wrong? Right? It takes resources from somebody else, but you could argue it gives more resources to you than the resources you're taking from somebody else if you're stealing small stuff. Right? So there's all ways that we can justify things. Remember, the nihilist would say it doesn't really matter. As long as you have intrinsic value, it's okay. All right. So there's a couple rules, and you'll have to start writing down these rules. Universality says, under similar circumstances, morality must be applied equally, right? So if I'm applying morality to myself, it must be the same morality I apply to other people. So I say if it's okay to steal, then it must be okay for people to steal from me. But most people don't think like that. Well, they have more than I do, but it doesn't matter. What if it makes them feel good? Impartiality assumes that everyone should be considered equal in applying moral judgment. Right? It doesn't always happen in our society like that. Right? And reasonableness, right, states that norms should be based on moral reasoning, not knee-jerk response. So reasonableness says we should look at a deontological point of view. Is it right or is it wrong? And then we set guidelines to that. So this whole application of this are really called laws. So laws are application of ethics, right? The application of deontological ethics is what they are, right? And they should be applied universally within our culture, impartially within our culture, and reasonably within our culture. But they're not always that way. Right? And we find that, and if you've been watching the news at all in the last 2 months, you'll see that there's lots of arguments going on right now, right? This whole movement really is all about the fact that these three conditions don't always occur in our society. All right. Obligation of values. So moral obligations are things we ought to do or ought not to do. Right? Those are our moral obligations. Right? And moral values are things that we intrinsically deem as good or bad. Right? So remember, when we look at these things again are subjective. Right? Those are our own personal meta-ethics. Right? What we find value and what we find justification. All right, so if you look at a couple scenarios here. right? And go through them. Oh, look at the first one, Desmond Tutu, very famous guy from South Africa. Is it our moral obligation to give every child the very best education possible? Right? So we'll look at that. Is this applied universally and impartially? Do houses in better districts that pay more taxes have more funding for education than schools in very poor neighborhoods? And the answer is yes, it's true. If you live in a better neighborhood, your school has better funding. You usually get better quality teachers because they want to teach students they're not afraid of. And the education level tends to be better, right? So is this something we can say that is being impartially applied? Or is best education just mean the best we can do? Right? So that's, do we have a moral obligation to participate in research? Right. So if they come to you and say, hey, we're testing a new vaccine and we need you, right, to come test with us, do you have a moral obligation to society to participate? Or you could argue, yes, I'm healthy, I'm in a low risk group, and I could help many more people. What do you get out of it? You get maybe a potential vaccine, or maybe you get a placebo. Remember, a placebo is a fake, right? Maybe you just get, salt water instead of the real vaccine, and you walk around and think I'm vaccinated, right? The CDC and the FDA have now looked at what they call challenge testing. Right? Challenge testing, they'll be exposing people. It usually isn't done. It's not ethical, but the FDA is thinking about it because we're pushing a vaccine through. Is they'll expose people in the vaccine trials to a live virus, right, for COVID. Right? So if you get the placebo, is it ethical to expose you to that vaccine? Look at this one. Is it a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful? Right? That's a hard one, because what if what you find meaningful is immoral? Right? Look at Adolf Hitler. Right? He thought it was his moral obligation to pursue the killing of the Jewish nation. Right? He thought that was meaningful. Right? So this is a completely intrinsic, that's a nihilist view. Do we have a moral obligation to promote social justice? Should you stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves? Right? Should you pursue universality, right? Impartiality, and all that kind of stuff? Right? Do you have a moral obligation to it, or can you just sit back and say, other people will do it for me? And I like this one. Now, I am a mostly vegan, but here's what's put out by vegan groups. Veganism is not a matter of opinion, lifestyle, partial, or particular circumstances. It's a moral obligation that binds us all of us, just as moral obligations that involve fundamental human rights. There's problems with this statement, right? So I decided to kind of be mostly vegan because of environmental issues, right? But this is not about human rights. This is about personal, right? Personal opinion and what we think our moral obligations are. But it's not necessarily a societal thing, because society doesn't view that way. Well, anyway, hope you got some good stuff out of this. I look forward to talking to you later and discussing it. All right, bye for now.